Okay, so at this point, I would like to thank you for joining us, and I'm going to introduce Nicole Breslow, who will be helping to moderate today's webinar. She's a co-lead for our Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance. Have a great session, Nicole.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on using cost analysis to inform decisions about professional learning. I'm Nicole Breslow, and I co-lead the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance with my colleague Candice Bocala. The Regional Education Laboratory, Northeast Islands, partners with school districts, state departments of education, and others to use data and research to improve academic outcomes for students. The Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance is one of 10 research alliances and partnerships that REL Northeast Islands has developed with regional stakeholders in various priority areas. So our alliance supports district leaders in the Northeast region to make evidence-based decisions regarding the selection, adaptation, scale-up, and/or discontinuation of professional development programs and interventions. This is our agenda for today. After I introduce our speakers, I'll be turning it over to Dr. Fiona Hollands, who will be providing an overview of the various cost analysis methods and how they can help with making decisions about professional development. We'll then hear from two district leaders from Maine who will describe a challenge they were facing related to professional development that may be familiar to many of you. They'll share some of their questions, some of the questions they were grappling with about how to design a high-quality professional development model in a financially efficient way. Dr. Hollands will then help us understand how we might use cost analysis to answer some of the questions raised. We'll then have some time for a Q&A. We encourage you to write your questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we will address them during this Q&A time. So our goal for today is to build your knowledge of the ways to estimate resource requirements and costs of implementing educational strategies and programs. We also want to help you understand the relationship between different methods of cost analysis, the questions they can answer, and the data needed to conduct these analyses. And we'll also demonstrate how a district or school might use cost analysis methods to inform resource allocation decisions. We have three wonderful presenters today. Dr. Fiona Hollands is Associate Director and Senior Researcher at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies of Education at Teachers College. We have two district leaders from Maine. Anita Bernhardt is the Director of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment for York School Department, and Heidi Early-Hersey is Director of Professional Development for MSAD number 60 in North Berwick, Maine. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hollands now to tell us about cost analysis.
Great, and can everybody hear me clearly? This is Fiona at Teachers College, Columbia University. Somebody type in yes if you can hear me fine. Yes, great. Okay, so the first part of my presentation is an overview of several cost analysis methods that can be used in education. And then later, after Heidi and Anita describe their cost challenge, I will be going into details about how to actually calculate costs. If you do hang in that long, you might want a calculator, and you'll certainly want some very strong black coffee. So the first question I want to address is, what is cost analysis in education? Very simply, it involves the identification of all resources or ingredients that are needed to implement a program. These include personnel time for planning, execution, and training, which often constitute 70 to 80% of all program costs for educational programs. They also include things like materials and equipment, facilities, transportation, and other support services. Once you know what types of resources are needed, you actually need to know the quantity and quality required. So for example, if you're doing a train the trainer session, you know you need a trainer, but more specifically, you'll need to know maybe you need them for 20 hours of preparation and delivery time, and you might be looking for someone who has at least 5 years of experience. With all these details in hand, you can estimate the dollar value of each of the resources. And then, if you're collecting other data on the programs, it's possible you could balance the costs against effectiveness, benefits, or the utility of the program, where utility is basically an economic term for satisfaction or usefulness of a program to you and your stakeholders. It's really important to recognize that cost considerations go beyond the apparent ticket price. So it's really helpful to document the use of existing resources even if you aren't writing any new checks for them, and to consider the reallocation of resources from one program area to another. The ones that are really easy to recognize are the new investments and expenditures. But while the current expenditures are really easy to think about, people often forget to consider future commitments. Take, for example, in some districts, teachers who complete professional learning earn higher salaries into the future, which is a significant hidden cost of professional learning. There may be some savings, and we'll look at some examples of that in the case study later on. And finally, some resource needs might be filled by in-kind contributions. So, for example, in an elementary school, parents might come in and volunteer to read with children, which is great as long as you have those volunteers. But you do need to consider what would happen if all those volunteers went away and you actually had to pay a teacher aide to do it instead. So why is cost analysis important? First, there have been lots of studies that show that the cost of strategies that address the same outcomes can vary substantially. A simple example, if you think about tutoring for children to improve reading performance, you could have trained teachers do this, you could have adult volunteers, or you could have other students do peer tutoring, and clearly the cost of those three things is going to vary quite a lot. But you also need to consider that the impact could vary quite a lot. Second reason why cost analysis is important is because our resources are limited, and these should really be directed towards those programs and strategies that address your own education agency's goals the best. And finally, anticipating resources required for high fidelity implementation is really critical to program success and to program sustainability. So one example I love to give to demonstrate this is class size reduction in California. And the idea to reduce elementary class sizes came from an experiment conducted in the 1980s in Tennessee. Many of you will know that study, the STAR study with around 7,000 students. It showed that class size reduction helped to improve student outcomes. So around 10 years later, in 1996, California decided it would be a really good idea to implement this across the entire state with a few million students. Not surprisingly, the strategy floundered for a long time. And why? Because they didn't have enough qualified teachers, and they couldn't train enough teachers fast enough, and they didn't have enough space for all the additional classrooms created. So that would have been a good instance where if they had considered the resource requirements in advance, they might have decided to roll things out on a gradual basis rather than try and do it all at once. Oh, I guess I haven't been moving the slides forward. Thank you for whoever's doing that for me. They're obviously going along. I will try and attend to it, but it seems like you're doing a better job than I am. So another important lesson that we've learned about costs is that implementing a program at different sites can cost quite a lot, different amounts. So some of my colleagues here at our research center estimated the cost of implementing a program that many of you are familiar with, Read 180, an adolescent literacy program. And they considered the cost of implementing the program if they followed the vendor's recommendations for implementation. And then they looked at the cost at 3 real live sites. So you can see in the bottom orange bar, if the program is implemented according to the developer's instructions, the cost would be about $1,100 per student. Looking at the real live sites, the first site 3 cost about a quarter of that amount. At site 1, the costs are about half that amount per student, and site 2 was $400 more than what you might expect. So if you're curious to know what each of the sites is doing so differently to result in such different costs, you can read the paper that's referenced at the bottom, Levin, Catlin, Alston, 2007. It's quite eye-opening. This paper and any others that I refer to will be in the reference list at the end of the slides. So hopefully at this point I've convinced you as to why cost analysis is important in general in education, but why should we care about it particularly for professional learning? Here again, quite a few studies have documented the enormous amount of money and time spent on professional learning and professional development across the country. You may be familiar with the New Teacher Project Mirage report that came out in 2015, which showed that teachers spend an average of 19 school days per year on professional learning. That's 10% of their time. Districts on average spend $18,000 per teacher per year on professional learning. If you divide that by the 19 days, you're talking about almost $1,000 per professional learning day per teacher. And this $18,000 per teacher amounts to a pretty significant chunk of the district budget, 6 to 9%. Despite these large investments of time and money, returns appear pretty limited. So in that particular study, only around 40% of the teachers reported that professional learning activities were a good use of their time. So what cost metrics are actually useful to decision makers? First of all, total program costs for all participants who are served, whether that's the teachers or the students. Then you want to look at average cost per student or teacher served. It's also helpful to look at a range of costs per participant if some participants require more resources from the program than others. So you might want a low and a high as well as the average. And then finally, the marginal cost of adding each additional participant to an established program can be useful. So if it's normally serving 50 students, you might want to know what does it cost to add that 51st student. That would be the marginal cost. Some useful ways to think about costs are separating them into fixed and variable costs. So an example might be if you're planning a professional learning event, the fixed costs would probably be the district administrator's time to plan a professional learning event, because that's probably going to be more or less the same whether it's for 10 people or 20 people participating. Presenter fees are probably also going to stay the same. So those are the fixed costs, while variable costs are the ones that are going to go up in line with the number of participants. So stipend, food, and materials would be examples. As we saw with the READ 180 example, it's a good idea to look at whether costs vary across sites due to implementation differences. And then it also helps to look at how the costs are spread among multiple stakeholders. So in education, these stakeholders might include the state education department, the district office, the schools themselves, and then of course we all know that teachers often pay for things out of their own pockets. So for example, they might be paying for a degree program. When you first think about doing a cost analysis, it's important to figure out what it is you really care about. So first, whose costs are you concerned about? Is it costs to the district office? Is it costs to the school, the teachers, the taxpayer, the state education department, or some combination of all of those? Next, what kind of costs do you care about? Is it total cost starting from scratch? So for example, if you're creating a charter school, you're really going to want to know what does it cost from beginning to end? Or are you just concerned about the incremental costs above and beyond what you're already incurring? So for example, if you are adding an after-school program to an already existing school program. And then over what time horizon should you be estimating the cost? Is it just for this year only? Is it for the next 5 years or some other time period? What you choose to focus on should really be determined by what the decision is that you need to make. And here's some examples of decisions you could be making with cost analysis. So it might be the case that you want to determine the resources needed and the associated costs to implement a new program. You might be looking at resource allocation in an existing program or between several existing programs. You could be looking to identify which sites are doing the best job implementing a program in order to look for best practices. Or you could be trying to decide whether to scale up or scale back on a program. So just in case you think you'll be doing all this on your own, I would like to introduce a tool that our research center developed with funding from IEF to help users estimate the costs and the cost effectiveness of educational programs. It's called CostOut. It's free to use. It's available online. If you search CostOut on the internet, it should come up. And all you need to do to use it is to register a few details and agree to terms of use. This is the actual URL. It doesn't come up as CostOut. And what does it do? It does help to estimate and compare costs of implementing educational programs. You would enter a list of ingredients that you need to implement the program, and then you can either enter local prices, so salaries, materials prices that you know about, or you can use the database that's in the tool of national average prices of educational resources. So that includes teacher and principal salaries, materials prices, all kinds of ingredients that are used in education. So the tool can help you estimate total program costs and cost per participant. It can help you assess how costs change as the number of program participants varies. It can help you assess how costs change as one resource is substituted for another. And it can also make it clear who will pay for which aspect of implementation. So at this point, I'm going to introduce 4 different types of cost analysis that are relevant in education. Cost feasibility analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, cost benefit, and cost utility analysis. And for each of these, I am going to talk about the purpose of the program, of the type of analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about pros and cons, give you an example from the literature, and then provide an example of how you might apply this kind of analysis to professional learning. So the first one is cost feasibility analysis. You might use it to determine whether adequate resources are available to implement or scale up a program. The advantage of this is that you can very quickly identify or rule out choices based on the feasibility of implementation. The disadvantage is that you're only thinking about costs here. You're not considering what's gained from the program. An example from the literature is Brewer, Kropp, Gill, and Reichert, who in 1999 estimated the cost of reducing class size in grades 1 to 3 throughout the US. If only they had done that a few years earlier, California might have done things differently. For an application of professional learning, you might want to figure out how many teachers the district could afford to send to a week-long summer institute each year. Next, we're going to move on to cost effectiveness analysis. The purpose of cost effectiveness analysis is to compare programs, so it can help you determine which of several programs results in desired effects at the lowest cost. So for example, if you're looking for something that will help you increase performance on reading tests by 10% above and beyond business as usual, you might be looking for a program that will do it that's at the least cost. Alternatively, if you know you have a fixed amount to invest, so $1,000 per student, for example, you might be looking for a program that's going to give you the biggest effect on reading comprehension, so the most bang for your buck. In terms of advantages, it can help choose among several alternative programs, and it doesn't just look at costs, it looks at the effectiveness of the program as well. A disadvantage is that you can only consider one type of outcome at a time. So you can compare several programs which improve the graduation rate, but you would not be able to compare a program that improves the graduation rate to one that improves kindergarten readiness. An example from the literature is a study that I conducted with a number of my colleagues comparing 5 dropout prevention programs to see which one was most effective, cost-effective at producing high school graduates. I'll show you the results in a second, but an application of professional learning might be to investigate which of 3 alternative professional learning strategies leads to the greatest improvements in teacher evaluations. So I said I was going to show you the results of that study in which we looked at the cost effectiveness of 5 dropout prevention programs. If you look at the blue bars on the left, you'll see that we estimated the cost per student served, first of all, and the most expensive program per student served was Job Corps, that cost about $22,000 per student, and the least expensive was Talent Search, just over $3,000 per student. I guess I can use this little arrow. On the right-hand side, the purple bars show the cost effectiveness metric, the cost per extra graduate. Now remember that just because students are served in a dropout prevention program doesn't mean that they don't drop out at some point. So if you're wondering why is it so much more expensive per extra graduate, it's because many of the students dropped out of these programs. And here we're also looking at the cost per graduate above and beyond the ones that would have graduated in the control group anyway. So if 20 people would have graduated in the control group who weren't participating in this program, and then, sorry, what did I say, 20 people graduated from that group and 30 from this group, it's only 10 extra graduates that you're talking about as a result of this particular intervention. So in this case, you can see that New Chance was the least cost effective because it costs the most per extra graduate produced. And Talent Search does remain here is the most cost effective. The problem with New Chance in this case was that it served new mothers with their children, so there were 2 people being served, and they're also most at risk of dropping out from the programs in the first place. So let's move on to the next type of analysis, which is cost-benefit analysis. The purpose here is to estimate whether the economic benefits of a program exceed the cost. The advantage here is that you can compare programs with different objectives, so you can compare the program that improves the graduation rate with a program that improves kindergarten readiness. A disadvantage, or more of a challenge I should say, is that you need to estimate benefits as dollar values and often over a long period of time. That's not so easy to do when you're dealing with young kids because you either have to follow them for many years to see what happens to them, or you have to make projections into the future, which can be pretty tenuous. But some of the more famous examples of cost-benefit example in education are the ones on early childhood programs. One of them is Belfield, Norris, Bernhardt, and Schweinhardt, who did a cost-benefit analysis of the high scope preschool program. And they figured that the costs in $2,000 were $15,000 per student. And the net benefits to the general public were $180,000 per student. So that was pretty impressive. There have also been a number of studies reported in the RAND 2017 report. It came out just, I think, in December on early childhood programs. So you could take a look at that if you're interested in more examples. And then in terms of an application to professional learning, you might be providing an activity to help teachers better support struggling readers and want to know whether the benefits of that exceed the cost. So here you might want to consider the dollar value of putting more students through special education or less students, the dollar value of repeating a grade or not, and then what happens to the students in terms of extra earnings if they graduate on time. So the last type of analysis I'm going to talk about is cost-utility analysis. And the purpose here is to compare the cost of the program with how well it meets stakeholder needs. The advantage here is that the analysis can accommodate multiple objective and subjective factors in decision making. So an objective factor might be something like effectiveness at improving reading comprehension, and a subjective factor might be how well each program satisfies teacher preferences. It's a great way to engage multiple stakeholders in decision making. It can be used even if there isn't hard evidence of program effectiveness. And it can be used when programs address more than one outcome. For example, the program might improve both reading and math achievement. The disadvantages of cost-utility analysis are that the results are only relevant to one particular context, and that's because every set of stakeholders is really going to care about very different things. The other disadvantage is that most practitioners are not familiar with how to calculate utility, although we just have started a project to create a new tool that will do that automatically. So we might be solving that problem in a year or so. And an example from the literature would be Lewis, Johnson, Erickson, and Brunix in '94, who did a cost-utility analysis of special education programs. I'm going to show you the results from that so you know what this actually looks like with numbers. And here you can see that they did the study in Minnesota, and the question was which of these 3 delivery models for special education services would provide the best satisfaction to stakeholders for the amount of money that they could invest in it. And the 3 models were delivery via an urban independent school district. The second one is delivery via an intermediate school district representing a consortium of districts jointly offering services. And the third one is via a special education cooperative, which is made up of multiple small to medium-sized independent school districts. And you can see the cost per student were the highest for the independent school district at $28,000. And the costs for the other 2 delivery models were within $1,000 of each other. In terms of utility or usefulness to the stakeholders, the intermediate school district provided the most utility. So just looking at these straight off the bat, you would probably rule out the independent school district. It costs the most and it has the lowest utility value, which reflects in the cost-utility ratio. It's the most expensive per unit of utility. So let's rule that one out right away. Then the other 2, it's a bit of a trade-off here between the $1,000 difference in cost per student and the 5 units of utility. So if you could afford it, you might choose the intermediate school district. If you couldn't afford the extra $1,000, you go with a special education cooperative. They actually, very strangely, have the same cost-utility ratio. And then how might you apply this to professional learning? It may be the case that you're considering 4 different professional learning strategies, and your stakeholders, who might be teachers and administrators, have indicated 4 requirements for these strategies. So one might be that the program or strategy fits with the district's current instructional goals. A second might be that it shows evidence of improving classroom practice. A third, that it responds to local teacher preferences. And the last, that it's feasible to implement within available professional learning days. So you basically would have to evaluate each of the 4 strategies to see how well they meet those 4 criteria. And the one that does would have the highest utility. You balance that against the cost, and that would inform your decision as to which one to go with. Okay, so those are the 4 kinds of cost analysis. Now let's take a look at some questions that you can use these methods to address with respect to professional learning strategy. The first, very simply, could be, where are we spending our resources? Which professional learning strategies are costing us the most or the least? And what are we getting for our money's worth? A second question might be, how do our costs change if we scale up a current professional learning strategy? And another question could be, what would it cost or save if we shifted from our current strategy to a new one? Additional questions could be about whether we could be more efficient as a district if we join forces with others. And this is something that Anita and Heidi will be addressing. And then finally, if you're able to collect information about the quality or effectiveness of the strategy or program, you'd want to know whether the resources are being spent on the highest quality or most effective professional learning strategies. I would just note that there are very few examples in the literature which look at both the cost and effective professional learning. And one exception is Shan's 2016 analysis of inquiry teams. And this is certainly an area that needs a lot more work done to look at both the costs and the outcomes of professional learning at the same time. So after Anita and Heidi talk, which will be in a couple of slides' time, I will be going into detail about how to estimate costs. But you should know that there are a number of cost frameworks that have been developed that are specific to professional learning or professional development. And I've listed 5 of these here. You can either click on the links to find them or they'll be referenced in the back. While they all vary to some extent, these are the professional learning costs that pretty much everyone agrees need to be considered. So first of all, district office costs, which includes the time of the professional learning administrator to research options, to plan events, supervise them, and get people to participate. Then there are costs that are incurred at the school, and one of the more important is that if teachers or coaches are offering professional learning, you need to hire substitute teachers to cover their classes. Then there's the teacher's time during work hours, which you would calculate using you calculate the cost using salary and fringe benefits. You should also consider uncompensated time, because while you may not be paying for it, it is an opportunity cost of the person's time, and at some point it is going to become a barrier to participation if teachers are spending a lot of uncompensated time and travel time too on professional learning activities. The more obvious costs are the teacher incentives, stipends or honoraria, the trainer salaries and fees or consultant fees for professional learning activities, travel costs, which again should include time, not just the travel itself, gas or train or whatever it is. Then there's the materials, equipment, facilities, and fees. You may be, as a district, providing tuition payments or reimbursements for graduate credits. And don't forget to think about any future commitments for salary increases, because that, as I said, is a cost that people often forget to include. And I think that is the end of my slide. So I'm going to hand it over to the next person.
Hi, this is Nicole Breslow again. I just want to interject. We had a couple of questions come in I think we have time for before we move on to our main speakers. We had a question from Scott. He was wondering, is there a single repository of professional learning related costing analyses available somewhere on the web?
Okay, so I did not find one myself, but I did find these studies and the frameworks. So Scott, if you do look through the reference list in the back of at the end of the slides, you'll find among the best of the studies that I found, and I'm sure I can find more, but no, there is no repository that I know of. If someone else knows of one, I'd be delighted to hear about it.
Okay, thank you. And there was another question referring back to the slide about the 5 dropout prevention programs. Todd wanted to know what the duration of these programs are. If you happen to know that information offhand? Trying to remember which slide
okay,
this is.
So
yeah.
This is a while back. I think most of those programs were sort of either less than a year or something like around 18 months at maximum. And in fact, different people were served for different amounts of time in the program. So somebody might have been in a program only for a few months and somebody as long as 18 months. The one that was more sort of long-term was talent search, because that starts in school. So somebody could be served over a period of several years. You might wonder, well, how does it end up being the least expensive? But it was a much more light touch program than some of the others. And it's perhaps because they started earlier that they were able to do a better job. But if you look up that the paper associated with it, the Hollands et al. 2014, it will provide a short description of each of those programs.
Great, thank you. One last question before we move on. A question from Bradley. Is it possible to summarize briefly how cost utility functions are calculated?
Okay, to summarize briefly, I'm going to tell you the most simple way to do it, or try to tell you the most simple way to do it. So basically, how would you do this? So let's imagine that one of the criteria that are being used to judge the program is teacher preferences, and you ask teachers to rate their preferences for the programs on a scale of 0 to 10. So you basically plot on a chart the scale, so 0 to 10, and you kind of just use it. If you assume a straight line function, you just draw a straight line, and if the average teacher preference ends up at 5, then if you're using a utility, I mean, you can choose whether you calculate utility between 0 and 1, 0 and 10, 0 and 100. We think 0 to 10 makes most sense. So there, the utility is on a straight line is very simply 5. Okay, because the average score was 5. So that's just for one criteria, and you do that for each of the criteria, and this is where it gets a little complicated. You put an importance weight on each criterion. So if teacher preferences is one of the criteria, and that might have it might be considered more important than another criterion, which could be effectiveness at improving reading performance. Then you calculate the utility for that. You have the utility for each of your criteria. You multiply it by your importance weight, and that gives you the overall utility. So my guess is I've already lost everybody very quickly on that. But that's the simplest way to do utility, is using a straight line function. And you can probably guess that utility may not actually work on a straight line, because it's possible that if you're talking about test scores, that you really care a lot about test scores improving, up to 10 percentage points, but that next 1 percentage point to 11 points of increase you may not care so much about. So your utility function would not be a straight line, but would sort of start to taper off at the top. That's just one possible example. But you can read more about cost utility analysis in Levin and McEwen 2001, which is in one of the references at the back. And I'm happy to talk all day about cost utility analysis if somebody really cares to, but it's not going to be now.
Thank you. We are going to move now to Anita and Heidi. They are going to tell us a little bit about a challenge they were facing in Maine related to professional learning, and then Dr. Hollands will come back on and share a little bit about how you might apply cost analysis to their dilemma. Anita and Heidi?
Great. Thank you very much. This is Anita, and I'll introduce my colleague Heidi. Hello. So before we kind of jump into the challenge, we'll give you a little context about our state. Maine is a rural state. It has about 1.2 million people in it, about 175,000 students, and 240 districts. So we're distributed across a lot of small units in the state. You can see on this map here where the districts across the state in red and green and blue are located. And if you look at the bottom lower corner, you see this outlined in red. You see the 3 districts that Heidi and I work in, MSAD 35, MSAD 60, and York School Department. Together we represent about 7,000 students, and that's about a little north of 4% of the students in the state. So that if you're trying to decide whether your context is similar to ours, that gives you a sense of who we are, so you can make comparable analysis.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of background about where we were as we entered into this project. So as Anita said, Maine in general is a large state. It tends to have pretty rural flavor, although in our extreme southern part of the state we're a little more tightly packed together than the rest of the state.
But regardless, we tend to be a state full of small school districts that work relatively independently and tend to try to solve problems in our silos, which means that often some of us are doing the same work as the district right next door, but we're not working together on it. We're also in a tough budget climate statewide, and all of us across the board have seen decreases in the funds that we have available for professional development and professional learning in our districts. And at the same time, we need to continue to support teachers in areas that we know are high leverage for instruction. This project, as I'm going to talk about a little later, is specifically focused around assessment for learning or formative assessment and how that drives the instructional cycle. That was our goal. But we were really looking to work together to overcome some barriers that we have. We have some good resources in our state on this topic, but where we're located in the state, it's an hour-plus drive for our teachers to participate in some of these opportunities that, say, for example, the University of Southern Maine might offer. And we wanted to sort of bring those opportunities to our teachers and work together in order to try to be more efficient and reach more teachers. At the same time as we were having these conversations, the state of Maine came out with what they call the Fund for Efficient Delivery of Educational Service. They're trying to get districts to work together to become more efficient, and they put some grant opportunities out there, which got Anita and I talking about the way our 3 districts might work together. I work for 2 districts, which are neighboring, and those 2 districts also neighbor Anita's district, so we are right together. And ultimately, our goal was to work collaboratively and as efficiently as possible to provide high-quality professional development in the area of assessment for learning for as many teachers as we could touch in our district and in our surrounding districts. We really wanted to make this a regional opportunity.
So our challenge was to make a meaningful request that would also be cost efficient in the delivery of professional development services. While that doesn't seem like a difficult question, we found it challenging because we tend to think about professional development as being what we can do with the money that we have. And this posed a very different question for us. To increase the efficiency of what we were offering, we reached out to districts within 2 counties. So those counties represent about 1/3 of the students in the state. Again, hoping to kind of leverage a broad spread of the resources across many kids and many districts. We wanted to, and this isn't cost efficiency as much as it is thinking about effectiveness, we wanted to propose something that would have lasting district leadership capacity, and that led us to this train the trainer model and to think about what the costs would be and how we could be more efficient in those costs if we put together a consortium of districts to deliver that, and including our university partners. So that's essentially the grant that we've submitted.
So basically what we did was we established a relationship with the University of Southern Maine to provide a great deal of the professional learning for our teachers, some coaching, and we really reached out to our colleagues in similar roles in the districts surrounding us in the 2 counties that we wanted to target. We got people on board, and then we started to think through what's the best model. We really want to use a train-the-trainer model so that we're not only teaching our instructional leaders, whether it's our teacher leaders, our coaches, or even some of our administrators, but that we're also simultaneously supporting the implementation of those practices in each of their home districts so that it's more embedded. So that's basically the goal of the project. And I think at this point, we're going to go back to Dr. Hollands, and our work with her was very helpful, and we'll talk more about it at the end, but it really helped us think through a bunch of the different pieces that we had to consider as we wrote this grant.
Great, so I'm going to take over again. Can someone type in yes if you can hear me in the chat box, just so I know I'm not talking to space? Yep, you can hear me. Great. All right. So we are now going to get into the nitty-gritty of cost of professional learning. So this is where you need the calculator and the copy. And I will say this slide looks pretty dull because the last time I saw it, there was a picture of a shiny pink piggy bank with my name next to it. But I think I expressed some anxiety about the association, so they've taken the pig away. But I guess I remain. So you have me for the next few slides. So what are we doing here? We are doing a cost analysis, an application of a cost analysis in practice for the Maine school districts. And the question that Anita, Heidi, and I were trying to address was how can we maximize the use of available professional learning resources to train instructional coaches in York and Cumberland County. So if you remember, the contextual issues that will be important for cost considerations is that we're dealing with small districts. Each has around 5 coaches that need professional learning and development on an ongoing basis. And we're dealing with rural locations, which means that you're getting, getting anywhere costs a lot, both in terms of gas, but also in terms of time. And this is certainly something that can serve as a deterrent to participation, because you're not paying people for their travel time usually. The solution being considered, as you heard, is to join forces with up to 10 nearby districts to plan and deliver professional learning for the instructional coaches. So the cost questions we came up with were the following. First, what are we paying for instructional coach professional learning now? And I use we, even though it's really they, but I guess I got rather invested in the project. And the second question is, how will this change if York and Cumberland County collaborate with other districts? To address the first part, we listed each current professional learning activity and then estimated the total cost of the activity. And then Anita and Heidi considered how many people participate and could figure out what the cost is per participant or per hour of professional learning delivered. The second part, what will change or how will costs change through the collaboration, we started off imagining that we would be able to obtain some economies of scale. We did wonder about how participation would be affected and what the implications of that would be, because remember that even if you become more efficient and lower the cost per participant or per hour delivered, you might get participation going up and end up with higher overall costs. And then the last question that took some figuring out for the costs involved was how would collaboration across the districts be coordinated? Whose responsibility would that be and what would that cost? So the first part, if you remember, was to list out the current professional learning activities being delivered and what the cost implications were for each of these. And they came up with 6 different professional learning activities. I'm going to go through all 6 one by one to talk about the cost considerations. I'm imagining that most of you have similar types of professional learning activities, so all these considerations should be relevant to you. So the first one is an annual 2-day professional learning conference that takes place at the University of Southern Maine. And this takes place during regular school work days, which is important to note. So beyond the current registration fee, whatever that is, you have to consider the coach's salary and fringe benefits for the 2 days in which they're participating in the conference. Now, you may say, well, why do I have to think about that? Because it's already in my budget. I'm not paying extra for that. But you don't want to ignore it because it is an opportunity cost for their time. If they're at the conference, they can't be doing something else, like they can't be coaching teachers during that time. If some of these coaches teach as well, then you'd need substitute teachers to cover their classes, so that's another cost. And then in this case, they're all reimbursed for travel, and the IRS rate that was in place at the time we did this was 53.5 cents per mile. So those are the considerations for the conference. Moving to the second type of professional learning activity. They run a Train the Trainer Summer Institute, and that's organized by the district and it takes place on non-school days. The important considerations here include the time of the district personnel involved in planning and delivering that session. So that would be calculated using a percent of salary and fringe benefits for those personnel. Then, of course, the obvious things, the presenter fees, the food, the materials, the travel reimbursement, and then whatever you're providing in terms of a stipend or honorarium for each coach. The third type of professional learning activity that they provide is a monthly day-long coaching seminar, which also takes place at the University of Southern Maine. That happens during designated professional learning days. So the students are not in school. That means there are no substitute teacher fees that need to be considered. And here you're basically just looking at the trainer fees, the travel reimbursement, and the coach salary and fringe benefits for the day. So there's three more. The fourth one is training modules that are optional for coaches at the University of Southern Maine, and they can get credit if they want to. This takes place in their own time. And here the district is only paying for the course credit fees, $1,200 per coach. The coaches are not paid for their own travel time or for the travel costs or the time actually attending, but those are opportunity costs of their time. The fifth activity is a dine and discuss, which happens 4 times a year at the university. This takes place after school. Because it's organized by the school district, you need to consider the planning and organization time of the district personnel. Again, that's a percentage of salary and fringe benefits. And then the obvious costs, food, materials, travel reimbursement. The last professional learning activity is individual consultations at the school district, and this happens during regular school days. So we have fees for the consultant, the coach's salary and fringe benefits for a day, any substitute teacher costs for people who normally teach. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out, and this took a little bit of figuring out, because each item requires some specific planning and supervising time, but there's also some general planning, investigation of options, and supervising time that takes place. Anita and Heidi estimated that that would be 10 days of time for each district, and that would be calculated with a percentage of salary and fringe benefits. I'm going to show you how to do that in 2 slides time. Okay, so those are the 6 different activities that currently go on and the considerations right now in the delivery by the individual districts. Some other ingredients you might want to consider, because I really talked mostly about personnel costs there, but also some of the obvious materials and fees. But these other things might apply in your situation. So you may have other district leaders involved in decision-making about professional learning. You may have a committee that spends X number of hours per year providing input on professional learning ideas. So you'd want to consider the number of hours there and calculate a percentage of salary and fringe for those personnel also. You might also want to consider a percentage of district overhead as part of your costs. That might include admin support, office equipment and supplies, and then just the basics like electricity, insurance, water, maintenance costs. Now, again, these things are probably all already in your budget, so you might say, why should I care about that? And maybe what you should consider most is whether any of these things will change as a result of changes in your professional learning strategy. And then there's facilities costs. You may be renting space for a special event, or you may just be using existing facilities and need to consider a percentage of those costs. So I promised to show you how to calculate the costs of the time for the district curriculum leader who's organizing the professional learning. And if you remember, Anita and Heidi estimated that took 10 days of their time each year. They have a 220-day work year. You may have a different number of days in your working year, so you just use whatever is relevant. You can use your actual local salaries and fringe rates, fringe benefit rates if you're looking for precise value for budgeting purposes. If you're just trying to get an idea of what the costs are, you can use a national average from the database in our CostOut tool and estimate the costs from that. Or the tool, the CostOut tool, will also allow you to make an adjustment for the particular state you're in. And Maine, as you probably know, has lower overall costs than the national average. So I used the national average salary for a K-12 education administrator and adjusted it for Maine. It gave me $89,000 per year. And I also used the CostOut database of fringe benefit rates and found a 50% rate for K-12 personnel. So the cost for those 10 days is just simply a fraction of time, so 10 out of the 220 days. And then you multiply that by the salary and uprate it by the benefit rate. So that gave me a total of $6,000 for the 10 days. Divide that by 10, that's just over $600 a day. And you do that for any personnel time using the appropriate salary and benefits rate. So just to show you a quick screenshot from CostOut, when you're adding ingredients for your program, you can access the database to search for the appropriate ingredient. You can see here that when I put in education administrators, I got several prices. You can only see the first two, and I chose this one. You can see the national average price was $93,000, and then the adjustment for Maine brought it down to the $89,000 that I showed you in the previous slide. Okay, so that kind of covers what's happening now, what the costs are now. So we next needed to consider how are these costs going to change if the 10 districts collaborate to serve 50 coaches. And as I mentioned to you, we were expecting some economies of scale, some things to be unchanged, and some added costs for the coordination time. So what we found is that for 5 out of the 6 professional learning activities, we could obtain economies of scale. I'm going to go through 2 of them in detail. The last professional learning activity was unchanged, and then we had to consider new costs. So let me just do a couple of the, show you a couple of ways in which savings were made. I'm going to pick here the second item on the slide, the Trainer Summer Institute, which takes place for 4 days. And the first thing to say is that they expected the same number of people to attend in both situations, whether it was done by the individual districts or all the districts together. So here some costs would be unchanged, things like food and materials, travel reimbursements, stipends, and honoraria for the coaches. The things that would change was the cost per presenter, and right now districts are paying $1,500 each for the presenters, and each district is spending 2 days a year organizing this particular activity. If you remember, the cost of 1 day was $608, so the cost for 2 is $1,200. So right now, each district is spending $2,700 for the presenters and organization time. Multiply that by 10, you get your $27,000. If they collaborate, they can do 1 institute for all 10 districts. The presenter costs are going to go up because they're serving 50 people at once, and they probably want to have multiple concurrent sessions to serve a wider range of needs and interests. Organization time will go down to 1/4 of a day per district, so that's the $608 times a quarter. It just gives you $152 per district, total of $1,500 for all 10 districts. So you can see that for all 10 districts, the institute would be about $4,500. That's quite a lot less than the $2,700 if each district does this individually. So the projected savings for the 10 districts is $22,000, $22,640. Divide that by 10, that gives you the savings per district. So the other one I was just going to mention, because it shows the travel cost differences, is the monthly coaching seminars. Where's my arrow gone? Come back, here we go. Okay, so this one. Right now, they're doing 6 sessions a year, and the fees for those are $2,000 per session, and each district is paying this, so that's $120,000 across all 10 districts. The travel costs are really high because the coaches are all traveling an average of 100 miles back and forth from USM, paying the $8 a toll, so it's like $60 of travel costs per coach. That adds up for 50 coaches to over $3,000. If they do a collaboration, USM has agreed to come and deliver the seminars locally. So they're going to pay $24,000 for the shared cohort format. The travel costs are going to go down quite substantially because the teachers are traveling an average of 24 miles rather than 100, no toll. So it's just 24 by 53.5 cents, gives you almost $13 per coach. So we have a total for 50 coaches of $640, quite a bit less than the travel costs over here. So this is where the big savings are, because the session itself costs $96,000 less, and travel costs are reduced by almost $2,500. And then if you look at the per district amounts, are just a tenth of that. So the last thing I just wanted to mention here, because this is a little tricky to figure out, the district curriculum leader time was also going to change as a result of this collaboration. And if you remember, originally in the current situation, Anita and Heidi figured that they were spending 10 days planning and organizing all these activities. So if each district has that going on, that's about $61,000 for all the districts. In a collaboration, they figured that they would probably just need a 2-person leadership team. Each of those people would need to spend 10 days on the planning and organization for all the districts. And then each of the 10 districts would need 1 day to coordinate with the leaders. So that's a total of 30 days across all the districts, and that amounts to about $18,000. So again, pretty big savings there, but 8 of the districts are seeing those savings, and the 2 who have the leaders spending pretty much the same amount of time and a little bit extra there would be experiencing additional costs. So some of the costs wouldn't change: the consultation, individual consultation, the stipends to coaches, and some of the materials costs weren't going to change at all. Do note that if you have durable materials, you can spread those costs out over multiple years. Okay, and the last thing that they considered was the extra cost of an event coordinator. This is exactly the same sort of calculation as what I showed you before, so you can just run through the numbers yourself. I just use a different salary for an event coordinator, and again, it's a number of hours per year. I made those turn that into days divided by the total number of days. Just to summarize what we have then, these are the net savings per district. The first 5 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, were the ones that all showed savings per district, net savings per district. The individual consultation, sorry about the fire engines in the back. The individual consultations were no change. With the district curriculum leader, organization planning and supervisory time, you'll recall that most districts experienced a saving, and a couple of districts were spending a little bit more. And then for the event coordinator, all districts would be spending a little bit more on that. So total savings per district, around $27,000, a few additional costs, but overall net savings of about $27,000. So the last question, and the million-dollar question here, is all this effort worth it to move from individual to collaborative delivery? So overall, the savings would be about $270,000 across the 10 districts, but you can't be sure that they'll all participate, so you might want to estimate costs and savings under different scenarios. Let's say there are only 5 districts participating or only 30 coaches being served. You might want to think about what else is gained. Are you going to be able to deliver higher quality offerings? Will you get greater participation? Are there additional benefits like the coaches are going to establish persistent professional networks? And what are you losing as a result of this? You're going to be giving up some autonomy in professional learning offerings. So that's it for my slides. I think now Anita and Heidi are going to reflect on the process we went through with this cost analysis and what they learned that was helpful or could be helpful in the future.
Okay, so one of the things that we became very aware of in our discussions with Dr. Holland and doing this analysis was that thorough cost analysis takes time and it takes the patience to look for all of the details. Heidi and I realized pretty quickly that in an effort to think about how to deliver professional development using the funds that we had, that this was a really different question that we were being posed. Is there cost efficiency in the proposal of collaboration? There definitely is. It's contingent upon having common goals, and that's we are hopeful that this will come to pass and that we'll find additional places to have common goals to be able to increase efficiencies with or without state funding available to us. The funding opportunities didn't provide us with multi-year opportunities to increase sustainability. That's something that also we became very aware of, and so we had to limit our scope. We had to deal with the grant that was made available to us, and it just didn't provide for that. In most professional development initiatives, you assume having the opportunity to develop learning and skill set over time, and we just don't have that as much in this model. Improvements that aren't fiscal are really important, were very important to us. They weren't a part of this grant, and that was sometimes frustrating. We built in measures of effectiveness, but they weren't part of the grant. We also became very aware that those also were important things to keep track of, and it would make sense in the future for us to be able to equate them to cost effectiveness to cost savings in some way, an entirely different set of calculations and thinking about the fundings and the efficiencies as well as the effectiveness. And Dr. Hollands helped us to understand that we sometimes conflated those two ideas and that they're really separate ideas.
And I would agree with everything Anita just mentioned. I think for me that I am the curriculum director for 2 districts, and so I'm always looking for opportunities to work collaboratively, to steal a good idea from one district and bring it to another. And I had a gut feeling that working together was going to be more efficient. I believed it, but going through this process with Dr. Hollands really helped me wrap my head around the different ways that we could be more efficient, and I believe we'll be able to be more effective in the long run too, for lots of contextual reasons that we described earlier. So it was a very helpful process, all in all, and I think it pushed Anita and I just to really look at our situation from different lenses that we wouldn't have looked at it from had we not had this opportunity. Yeah. One more here.
I think we've said this, but I think it bears saying again, efficiencies are different than effectiveness. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, we come to the professional development conversation often asking, how effective can we be with this amount of money? Mm-hmm. And this grant posed a very different question to us and made us look at the full context of efficiencies when we collaborate together and really understand what the savings are.
And I'm going to go to the chat and try to address a couple of the questions that are there. So one of the things, Elizabeth posed the question, you're losing some degree of targeting to the needs of each district in the PD provided, right? Is that an issue? I think that's an excellent question. And this, we chose with this project to focus on something that we knew was going to be impactful regardless of the specific district. We chose assessment for learning or formative assessment and how that really impacts instruction because we know that that's a high leverage strategy from the research. We believe that any district in our state would benefit from doing that work. That said, a model like this wouldn't necessarily allow you to address something really local, like a very local issue that might come up that may have to do with a particular curriculum program that you have in place or a particular issue that's come up. Do you want to add to that?
So the state of Maine requires all students to demonstrate their proficiency in state standards in order to graduate. That's maybe a similar context to your state or different context, but it provides, whether it's similar or different, for us it provides a place to come together because we're all looking for ways to increase student proficiencies and increase high-impact learning, the use of high-impact learning strategies among our states, among our districts. So it helped us to be able to have a learning space, a collaboration space was easily available to us on a larger scale than might otherwise be the case for science curriculum materials or math curriculum materials. This was kind of an easy target for us, and hopefully there'll be some additional ones.
And there's another question. Jessica asked how long our work with Dr. Hollands took. Was it weeks? Was it months? So I think we've probably been working on this project for a couple of months all told, but our actual work with Dr. Hollands really amounted to, I think, 3 conference calls. And two video conferences, and then I had a phone conversation with her. Probably 3 to 4 hours worth of work total.
And a lot of great guidance from us, from her, just simply saying, you need to focus on this. Initially we said, this isn't a project that we could afford to do. So we had to really think about if we really did this as individual districts, what would the costs be? That was not a question that we were used to asking, and that was probably one of the best questions that Dr. Hollands posed for us. So if you really were going to do this alone, well, we wouldn't really do this alone because we couldn't afford to, but if you really were, that's the starting point for the discussion about how efficient you can be if you work together.
The other piece that it forced Anita and I to really take stock of was the impact of work like this on our time and our jobs as curriculum directors, because typically projects like this come along and we just absorb it into what we do. And to force us to stop and really say out loud how much of your time is this going to take and what's the actual dollar value to put on that was eye-opening for us as leaders who tend to wear lots of hats and try to just get done what needs to be done.
Thank you so much.
Any other
This is Candace. I was going to move us along to the Q&A slide so we can take some more general questions that have come up from our audience. So we also wanted to start with a question from Gretchen. Maybe going back to Dr. Hollands, what model would you use to essentially compare the effectiveness of the professional learning against the cost analysis?
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me. When you say what model,
yeah.
I don't know if you mean which analysis, and that would be a cost effectiveness analysis, where you basically want to look at what business as usual is, and then have your treatment situation, and you need to look at the difference between your business as usual and your sort of intervention, whatever that is, both in terms of differences in cost and the differences in effectiveness. And then you put those two together as a cost effectiveness analysis. So as I pointed out during the presentation, not much has been done in professional learning that's really cost effectiveness analysis. And that's because most people don't really have a good way of figuring out how effective it is. Like, do you look at outcomes for the teachers, or can you actually look at outcomes for the students to see if they've improved as a result of the professional learning that has been provided? But if you really want to do cost effectiveness, that's what's required. It's much harder to do, and it's certainly not done over the course of a few phone calls.
Thank you. If others have questions, go ahead and put them into the chat room. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. I'll ask one that I know was something that came up in our conversations in planning for today. What are some of the ingredients that school districts specifically usually forget about when calculating costs?
Okay, so I think that's a question for me, but I think Anita and Heidi actually did address that a little bit, and I think the things that people forget about most of the time involved of various people, that they often think about the obvious things like, oh, well, we're paying teachers to attend, we're paying presenters to present, but they forget about the fact that they spent 3 days planning an event, and not only did they spend 3 days planning an event, but their admin assistant spent 5 days trying to recruit participants and coordinating with them all, and then doing expenses afterwards for travel or whatever it was. And they forget that the superintendent actually spent 2 hours in a meeting discussing professional learning activities. And the one, of course, that I mentioned earlier was the future salary increases. Most people know they exist, but they don't consider it a cost of professional learning. Does that answer the question adequately?
Yes, thank you. I remember that we did have those conversations and thought it would be useful for our audience to hear that reinforced. We do have a question from Elizabeth. What outcome metrics can you cost out in professional development on the benefits side? And then there's the follow-up in other education domains.
So when you ask that question, I think you're asking about a cost-benefit analysis. Is that right, Elizabeth? Type in yes, if it is. Otherwise, I'm just going to assume that's the case. So this is where, here we go, she's typing. Yes, okay, good. All right. So if you remember the cost-benefit analysis, what's tricky about that is that you need to monetize the benefits. And most of the time, the way those are done, so take the early childhood programs, the kind of outcomes they're going to monetize are the earnings of the participants once they get to working age. And that's what I was saying, is that you have to follow the participants over long periods of time or project out over long periods of time. So earnings would be a key one. And it's not just earnings to the participant after they graduate from school or graduate from college, because earnings are higher for people who graduate from college, but it's also what income there is to the Treasury, because they're going to pay their taxes, hopefully. There are benefits like reduction in the use of the burden on the criminal justice system. There are improved health outcomes, which means lower costs on the health system. So these might seem pretty far away from the concerns of the school practitioner. In the example I gave, I tried to bring it back a little bit to in-school considerations. So an outcome to look at is how many students have to repeat a grade, because that costs it double. I mean, basically you're paying twice for the same grade to be repeated. You might want to look at if students are less likely to go into special education as a result of an intervention, that's a benefit, and you can say we're, instead of paying whatever it is, $27,000 per year for special education, we're just paying the regular $12,000 a year for that student, if you think the intervention has prevented special education services needing to be provided. What other possibilities? Graduating on time, so it's a bit like the repeating the grade thing, but if they graduate on time, they start earning more quickly. Or they go to college first and then start earning after college. Those are some of the benefits that you could monetize.
We do have 3 more questions and only a couple of minutes left, so we might have to keep our responses pretty short, but we'll try to get to all of them. The first is, how do you include a calculation of take-up for a cost analysis? So if you wanted to create a policy to incentivize change, but you need to estimate how many people would change their behaviors based on a monetary incentive.
Okay, well, it would be helpful to have a more sort of contextualized example of that, because the best answer I can give without much context is you have to make some assumptions, and they have to be reasonable assumptions. And the best way of doing that is to talk to people who know something about whatever the situation is. I mean, Anita and Heidi had to come up with a lot of assumptions for us to do this cost analysis, and they were the best people to do that. So I knew the questions to ask them, but things, like how many people are likely to participate in this activity if you deliver it this way rather than that way. We had a conversation about that right before the webinar started, actually, that they were talking about the fact that if people showed up to University of Southern Maine to do a graduate course, they were going to all take up the credits for that. But if it were delivered online, there would be maybe only half the people would take that up. But that was an assumption that they made based on their past experience.
Thank you. Another question is it possible to capture the benefit of teachers staying based on the professional learning, since we know how expensive it can be if teachers leave in the first 2 years?
That is a fabulous question. I'm very glad whoever asked that. So it's something we think about quite often. It's a little bit difficult to know how to capture that, but the best way we thought of for capturing that is to consider the cost of hiring new people in terms of the amount of time that's spent hiring someone, which, as you say, is really quite substantial. So if you can capture the amount of time spent and estimate the amount of time spent to hire one person, and then you can look at how much that's reduced by estimating how much reduction there is in turnover. So that if you have half the number of teachers turning over each year, you've cut your cost in half, your hiring cost in half. Now, there are other benefits, of course, of teachers staying longer because they probably perform better, but that would require a much, much more complicated set of assumptions about the impact they have on their students and the benefits that arise from those. So I've given you what I think is a feasible way of coming up with a calculation on that.
Thank you. As we transition to our last question, I also want to point out for the rest of our audience that we're collecting data on how you might use what you've learned today in your work. So if you can think of a few ideas, please put them into our chat. We're really interested in how you might use what you've learned or what was new about what you learned today. So our last question is, should you take into account the cost of scaling up data collection on outcomes? Decision-making about effectiveness would now potentially require longitudinal data from 10 different sites.
So, sorry, is this a question for me that we're adding here? Should you take into account cost?
I think so. And Brian, if you want to clarify what your question is in the chat, feel free to do that.
I'm not sure if I know exactly what you're asking there, Brian, but if you're talking about sort of some research aspect that's involved in a cost effectiveness analysis, we generally separate out the research costs from the cost of implementing a program. And maybe the best rule of thumb when you're doing a cost effectiveness analysis is that you only want to include the costs of ingredients that could possibly have an impact on your outcome of interest. So one example is if you need to administer a screening test to figure out who should be treated and who shouldn't be treated, we would include that in the cost effectiveness analysis. But if you do another test like after the interventions ended to figure out how do people perform, that thing at the end has no impact whatsoever on the outcome because it's already happened, right? So you wouldn't include that. So as I say, we generally keep research or data collection costs separate from the implementation costs of the intervention. I have no idea if I'm really answering your question. If I'm not, send me an email clarifying what you want to know.
Thank you so much. This is a great time to transition to our contact information, which is up on the slides. You can contact any of us with further questions if you didn't get an answer today. I'd like to thank Anita Bernhardt, Heidi Early-Hersey, and Fiona Hollands for being our presenters on today's Bridge event. Thank you so much on behalf of the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance. And I'll turn it back to Ashley to close.
Thank you, Candace. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We had great participation, a really rich webinar and discussion. And as I said earlier, today's recording, this webinar was recorded, and the recording will be archived and uploaded to the IES YouTube channel as a video. If you registered for today's webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording when it is ready. Additionally, as we said, you can download the files from today's webinar from the download pod. And again, thank you for participating, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.